Picture the scene. On a beautiful summer's day, the 4th of July, 1862, an Oxford don by the name of Charles Dodgson set off on a boat trip down the River Thames, accompanied by his friend the Reverend Duckworth and 3 young girls, Lorena, Edith, and Alice Liddell. Dodgson was a family friend of the Liddles, and the girls' father was the dean at Christ Church. The sisters had often delighted in the wonderful stories Dodgson would invent, and on this particular trip, 10-year-old Alice Liddell begged him to tell them a new one. Taking Alice's name for his character, Dodgson began to tell the children a story about a curious little girl who falls down a rabbit hole. And the rest, as they say, is history.
What is the use of a book without pictures or conversation? Oh dear, I shall be too late. Curiouser and curiouser. One side will make you grow taller, and the other side will make you grow shorter. Why is a raven like a writing desk? What's the answer? I haven't the slightest idea. Off with her head! Off! But I don't want to go among mad people. Oh, you can't help that. We're all mad here. I've often seen a cat without a grin, but a grin without a cat.
This episode of Willow Branches is all about, you guessed it, Lewis Carroll, the pseudonym of Charles Dodgson, and of course his books Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. I was joined for the discussion by Franziska Kohlt and Charlie Lovett. Francisca, or Fran, is a researcher in science communication and the history of science and literature, with her doctoral thesis centering on dreams and visions in Victorian psychology and fantastic literature. She is also the editor of the Lewis Carroll Review and reviews editor of the British Society for Literature and Science. Charlie is a writer of fiction and non-fiction and has written or edited 9 books about Lewis Carroll, including Lewis Carroll, Formed by Faith, the first full-length study of Carroll's religious life. He has served as the president of the Lewis Carroll Society of North America, as editor of the London-based Lewis Carroll Review, and has lectured on Carroll around the world. Both of them are absolute experts on Lewis Carroll, and it was a joy and a privilege to speak to them about his life and work. So, hello, welcome to Francisca and Charlie. It's an absolute joy to have you here.
Thank you, it's good to be here.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this.
So you are both really passionate Lewis Carroll fans and scholars even, and I'm really excited to hear your kind of insights and for you to share your knowledge about. He was clearly a fascinating man. I'd really like if we could start by you just telling us a little bit about your own personal history with Lewis Carroll and your connection to him and his work. So when did you start to become interested in him and why?
For me, it really started when I was a child. My mum took me to see the film Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, the Disney cartoon in cinema. And I watched it and I loved it, but I also was quite puzzled. And I asked my mum, what does it all mean? And my mum probably was quite puzzled by the question herself and didn't quite know how to react. So she did the best thing she could have done. She took me to a library and said, well, let's see if we can find some books about Alice in Wonderland. And we found this absolutely fascinating book, which I recommend to anyone who is looking for somewhere to get started, which is called The Other Alice. It's a children's book, illustrated children's book about the story of how Alice came to be. And for me, I was probably about 8 or 9, this was an absolute eye-opener. It was an eye-opening moment that there's a meaning to a story that's about something else, but also about so much more. And this was so fascinating to me that I really never stopped wanting to find out what it was all about, really. Not just about in Alice in Wonderland, but especially Alice in Wonderland.
That sounds fascinating. I hadn't heard of that book. I'll have to check that out.
Fran, is that Christina Bjork's book?
That's Christina Bjork's book. Yes, that's right.
So that could sort of segue into my story, but it'll tell you how much older than Fran I am, because as an adult, I was at the conference in Oxford where Christina was researching that book.
Oh, wow. Okay, I think that came out the year I was born.
Yeah. So my passion also started in childhood, though, but it was actually listening to the LP records of the British actor Cyril Richard reading Alice in Wonderland. And we just had these records in our house. I don't know where they came from. And so I had listened to the book many, many times before I ever read it, as words on a page. And my father was a book collector, and I thought that would be interesting to follow in those footsteps. And so when I was searching around as a young man for something to collect, I thought, well, Alice in Wonderland, I like that book, and there must be some different versions of it, maybe different illustrators or something like that, having no idea what I was getting into, really. And that led to, gradually an interest in Lewis Carroll himself, and then the discovery of what a multifaceted person he was, and then ultimately, a career writing books about him that mostly stemmed from questions that I had after I read other people's books about him. The book I have that's coming out next year is about Lewis Carroll's religious life, and that really came from reading so many biographies where his faith would be sort of mentioned but not delved into in any real deeper, meaningful way. And I thought, well, wait a minute, I want to know more about this. So it's really been a journey of curiosity, as Alice would put it.
Mm.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the same with me and his interest in science.
Yeah, it sounds like he had a lot of deep interests in a lot of subjects that people might not necessarily realise. Obviously, it's quite well known that he was a mathematician, and also that he, Lewis Carroll is a pseudonym, that his name was Charles Dodgson. Do we know why he chose to write under a pseudonym, and why he chose that particular name?
Yeah, he had written a number of poems under pseudonyms as a young man, and seemed to want to. He was also starting to publish mathematical works at the same time, and he seemed to want to kind of make a delineation between, his books published as a scholar or as an educator, and then books that were or poems that were sort of more humorous and could be seen as frivolous, and so it was not at all unusual for somebody to have a sort of name that they practiced their profession under, and then a pseudonym if they wrote humorous things. But the name was chosen by an editor named Edmund Yates. Lewis Carroll sent him several options, including some anagrams of his name, like Edgar Cuthwellis. It's hard to imagine Alice in Wonderland by Edgar Cuthwellis. But Lewis Carroll was simply derived by taking his Christian names, Charles Lutwidge, and turning them into Latin, and then sort of turning them back into English again. And that's where the name came from. But lucky for us, Edmund Yates picked that one instead of one of the others.
I think one thing that's really interesting is that he did really quite consciously use the name Lewis Carroll and how famous it had become. And his work in logic, for instance, was something that he really wanted to get out into the wider public. And so he published things like The Game of Logic, which he published under the name Lewis Carroll. He used Lewis Carroll because he knew that would get him the attention. It's the author of Alice in Wonderland who's saying something here. So he did use the famous name later on to get other things into the wider spotlight of public attention quite consciously.
So could we talk a little bit about the Liddells or the Liddells? Was it Henry Liddell?
Yep.
Was the dean at Oxford, and his three daughters became quite close friends with Lewis Carroll, and one of their daughters, Alice, is known as the inspiration for the Alice of the books. I'm interested to hear a little bit more about that, and how much influence that had over his works.
Well, I think it's quite important to look at Lewis Carroll's lives before he met the Liddell sisters. It's quite commonly sort of framed as a sort of blurb on the back of books or local tourist guides as the thing that there was suddenly these three girls, and that one in particular that suddenly sparked this super famous book. But it's quite important to, before we get to that bit, to say that Lewis Carroll had a massive family of his own. He had many siblings, and he was a really great storyteller before this. This was a real gift that ran in the family a little bit, but he was really good at telling stories to his siblings to entertain them and so on and so forth. So he was at Oxford before Henry Liddell arrived at Oxford. He became dean when Alice was around about 3 years old. I think Charlie might want to correct me.
Yeah, that's right,
but I think
1855.
that's about
Yeah.
right. And there was more little children than that. But one day he met the little sisters when he was about to take a photograph at Christchurch. He was, of course, as we also know, a photographer, and he was experimenting with taking a photo of the cathedral spires when the three children bustled into the courtyard, and you can almost imagine them sort of bouncing around asking, oh, what are you doing here with a photography? Because of course this was a brand new thing. And he tried to take a photograph of the three of them, and Victorian photographs took a very long time to take, so you can almost picture it, him telling them stories to make them sit down still. And of course he records in his diary that day that they became very good friends. But there was of course a sort of long history of him being a very good storyteller before that. So there's always quite a lot of sensationalizing that relationship, but actually it was something that he was naturally good at. He was good at telling stories, and when he met them, I think that was a continuation of that. Of course, he continued to tell stories to all sorts of people, but Alice was the one who then asked, oh, can you write this down? And he did. He put a lot of energy into it, and the story changed and changed and changed again until it became what we know now.
And I think it's important too. You talk about that he had these relationships with children, and most of his siblings were sisters, and most of his siblings were younger than he was. He was the oldest boy,
Exactly.
And so yes, from childhood, he had this ability to entertain young children, and in particular young girls. And that was not anything that went away after Alice. That continued for the rest of his life. And another one of the common myths was that he would sort of discard these child friends once they became teenagers. And his diaries are filled with visits with grown women who have children of their own, who were people that he knew as children and told stories to, and played games with, and invented games for, and kept toys in his sitting room in order to entertain. And so it was a through line for his entire life. And it also, I think, very much connects to his core of faith, because as did many of the Victorians, certainly including Ruskin, and even if you go all the way back to Wordsworth, he really viewed the young child as something very close to God, as something having an innocence that the adult did not have. He talked about children being fresh from the hands of God. And so to him, spending time in the company of a young child was an entertaining experience, but it was also in many ways a religious experience.
Yeah, I know that there's I don't want to dwell on this too much, but I know, like you mentioned, I think, Fran, you mentioned that there's a lot of sensationalized stuff about these relationships, and I think a lot of people through modern eyes tend to think, well, there must have been something sinister about that if a grown man was so close with young children. But I mean, just briefly, in your point of view, do you think that's just a misconception? Do you think that's rubbish?
Oh, I think it's actively a misconstruction in very many of these cases. It's really quite entertaining when I'm also an academic, of course, and I teach Lewis Carroll's work, and often I see snippets of these things quoted in student essays and so on. And often I take the students back to say, oh, look, you cite this bit from this letter. Did you read the whole letter? And then it's, of course, these biographies that choose to frame things a certain way, sort of pick 2 or 3 things out, but if you read them in context, it stops making sense. So I think if you have to put that much energy into constructing your argument to make the case, then I don't think there's much of a case to it. So again, it's sort of slightly boring to dwell on it, because there's really so much more to be discovered in these relationships and these writings. And when people say, oh, he had such a close relationship, well, I mean, if you look at where the story comes from, in the 19th century, every well, not everyone, but most people would live in college while they're teaching. The dean, of course, lived in college with his children, and he was telling stories to the kids that were hanging out there. So I think, if you look at it that way, so it is a close relationship, of course, but it's not actually that strange at all.
No, I don't think so. And I think one of the words that Fran used, which has been sort of my almost mantra as I have researched Lewis Carroll, is context. So often people have drawn conclusions about Lewis Carroll and about other people too by looking at a small amount of evidence and then completely neglecting the context, not only the context within the canon of Lewis Carroll's own writings, but the larger cultural context. And we see this, in many cases. I see this he wrote these prayers in his diary, many of which, if you have no context for them, you would think, oh, he must have done something awful to be sort of begging such forgiveness from God. But when you look at them in the context of Anglican prayer life, in the context of the Book of Common Prayer, in the context of other prayers that Victorians wrote in their diaries, they're perfectly ordinary, and there are no bizarre, wild conclusions to be drawn from them. And so I think it's the same with many of these issues, that you have to sort of broaden your view and look at a wider context than just one relationship or one letter or one entry in a diary.
Yeah, I think it's very easy for people, like, without researching fully and delving in, just to pick on something that they think is, that's a bit of juicy gossip, and sort of get carried away with it. So
yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah. So the famous day, I think it was the 4th of July, was it 1862?
That's right.
When he went on a boat trip with the 3 girls, and Alice was begging him to tell them a story, and he kind of basically, from what I can tell, he made it up as he went along, and a lot of these elements ended up being what we now know as Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Although when he first wrote them down, was it not called Alice's Adventures Underground as well?
That's right.
Yeah, that's true. There's really sort of 3. Well, there's really 4 Alice books, but he wrote what everyone who was on that river trip, and almost all of them have published interviews or recollections of that trip on the 4th of July, 1862. Everyone said, well, what he wrote down in this manuscript, Alice's Adventures Underground, which was a manuscript that he wrote out and then illustrated himself and then gave to Alice as a Christmas gift 2 years later, that represented pretty much exactly the story that he told that day. That he was able to not only invent these stories off the top of his head, but to remember them well enough to go home and write them down over a period of the next few months. But then he rewrote that to be published as Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. He almost doubled the length of it. He added episodes, which probably were episodes that came from future storytelling sessions. We don't know that for sure, but almost certainly that was the case. And he also removed some sort of inside jokes that only the small group of people on the boat would have understood, jokes about a previous trip they had taken and family members and things like that. And so that gave us Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. And then Through the Looking Glass is written, I think, not in such an extemporaneous way, and it reads this way. It reads much more structured than Alice does. Structured around the chess game. And then, of course, the 4th one is a book called The Nursery Alice, which was a version of Alice in Wonderland that he adapted for younger children as sort of a picture book for, he said, ages 0 to 5.
That's right. And even the title of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland is something that he labors over. It's quite interesting when Charlie says, context, really important. One of the greatest gifts that the digitized age has given us is the Diaries of Lewis Carroll. And there's some scans to be found on them on the British Library website. If you're really interested in this, you can follow this up. But one of the fantastic things is, of course, the record of Lewis Carroll's diary from that day with his annotations is online. And you can see that he goes back to that diary entry and he has a look at, so how am I going to call this story that I invented back then? And he goes through various versions, because first it starts off as Alice's Adventures Underground, then it becomes Alice's Hour in Elfland and Alice's Hour in Fairyland, and and then eventually he crosses them all out and goes Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. That's the one.
Yeah.
Thank goodness. Yeah, it's hard to imagine we would be having this conversation if Edgar Cuthwellis had written Alice's Hour in Elfland.
I kind of want to see that on my shelf now, though.
Yeah, there's a parallel universe out there somewhere where that's the case. dreams are obviously a huge theme in both books. The fact that they are both shown at the end of the story to have been dreams of Alice. I think that's maybe a really interesting area to talk about. So what was the significance of dreams at the time he was writing, and why do you think that that's the way that the stories are presented?
Oh, I could talk about this for hours.
Yeah, good, yeah.
It's a really, really interesting question. Of course, it's hugely relevant to the way the book was written, but also rewritten. I think anyone can think of at least 10 novels off the top of their head that either contain a really important dream or are themselves dreams. And that's quite important from a literary point of view, because if you look at dream stories in the history of literature, but also the sorts of dream stories that Lewis Carroll had in his own library that he had read, that he had grown up with, also always have a very particular structure, a very particular aim. And it's really interesting when people say Alice is sort of dreamlike. They often connect that with a form of chaos, that it's sort of not connected, that it doesn't really hang together. But really, it does. It does. It has a really particular structure which mimics those dream novels really well. That starts with the fact that the original story is called Alice's Adventures Underground. If you think, for instance, of mythology, ancient Greek mythology, the catabasis, the dream narrative, was sort of a really substantial part of every hero's journey, where they go underground to confront the sins of their age in the underworld. But of course, that's also interesting because it's metaphoric. It's the realm of the dead, but also the realm of sleep. So there's an overlap here in the structure of sort of going underground to confront sort of sinfulnesses of the ages, embodied in grotesque figures, and then sort of rejecting all of this and having this cathartic moment of returning back to the world of the waking and the living is, of course, an established structure, and that taps into all sorts of convictions Lewis Carroll held personally, from a religious point of view, but also all sorts of other points of views. But the other interesting point is that Lewis Carroll was actually really interested in psychology and really wanted to know what dreams meant and what they did. And one of the things that fascinates me so much about the novel is how he really welds one to another and layers these ancient narrative structure with really contemporary science. And if you look at what science books he read, you can really see how he imitates the language as well when he adapts Underground to become Alice's Adventures and Wonderland. So that's something I find really fascinating.
I think it's also interesting to look at his own personal experience with the dream as a metaphor. So when he was 15 years old at rugby school, one of the masters at the school died, and the students came into the chapel to hear a sermon. And Archibald Campbell Tate, the future Archbishop of Canterbury, stood up, and about the third line in the sermon, he said to the boys, "What is life? Is it just a dream?" And this is the beginning of a metaphor that Lewis Carroll uses throughout his entire life. I think it shows up in the Alice books. It is most explicit in a little pamphlet he wrote called An Easter Greeting to Every Child Who Loves Alice, where he portrays the life that we live here on Earth as a dream, from which we wake to the true life of Christian resurrection in everlasting paradise. And this shows up again and again and again in his poetry, in his writing, and in his later books too. In the Sylvie and Bruno books, he really plays around with this idea of, am I dreaming or am I not dreaming? Is there a space that's kind of in between waking and dreaming? To what extent can I manipulate my own dreams? So it's something that fascinated him throughout his life on so many different levels.
Yeah, it's absolutely interesting how he picks up. It's like, as Charlie says, it sort of evolves through his throughout his writings, in his literary writings and his other writings as well. So it's really something that stuck with him his whole life, and he was searching for the meaning of dreams and what they really did on so many different levels. And so it's really interesting that on the one hand side, dreams are chaotic, but that also has a function, and that fascinates me as well. Sort of if you look into psychology. We still are not 100% sure what dreams actually do, but we have evolved in such a way as to still have them. So it's sort of tempting to look for their function. But something that was really common to think at the time of Lewis Carroll, when psychology really started to become an academic discipline, an academic field of inquiry in the Victorian age. In Britain, it developed very differently elsewhere. That was that people really believed that it revealed something on the inside of us. And Carroll sort of adapted this idea that you sort of pour it all out, sort of sort through it, and then sort of overcome what it indicates. So it was sort of a revelation of the true self in a way, but also it could reveal sort of repressed sins that we're holding, that we need to engage with, that we're sort of maybe not reflecting from or reflecting on enough. So that's really interesting, because the dream structure, which I mentioned, of those sort of dream novels that had been around before, was sort of that you reach a sort of deep point in your dream where you sort of have to confront yourself and everything that goes on inside it, and where all of those thoughts came from, what shaped those thoughts, and then overcome them and reject them. And that's really interesting, because Alice undergoes exactly that cathartic journey herself in that dream. So actually, in a way, it is chaotic and structured all at once.
Yeah, I love that.
Also, coming at it as a child reader, I think it's important to remember that this was originally written for children.
Yeah.
And there's a very simple thing at work here. It's a surprise ending, and I can remember having that moment of, oh, it was all a dream. Oh, this suddenly makes so much more sense, and that's a great, that's a literary device that he uses to absolute perfection. And that's why I was so disappointed when I first read the Nursery Alice, which he wrote for little children. Because it begins, I can't quote it exactly, but the first sentence is something like, once there was a little girl and she had a very strange dream. And I was like, spoiler alert, you just gave away the ending. But I think that is part of it. He is, it's not exactly a trick that he's playing on the reader, but it's this aha moment. And then there's this lovely passage that sometimes gets cut in modern editions that comes at the end of Alice in Adventures in Wonderland after she wakes up.
So Alice got up and ran off, thinking while she ran, as well she might, what a wonderful dream it had been. But her sister sat still just as she left her, leaning her head on her hand, watching the setting sun, and thinking of little Alice and all her wonderful adventures, till she too began dreaming after a fashion.
And her sister sort of sits there in the bank and thinks about the story and imagines Alice telling it to her children in the future. And it sort of frames the whole story as a pastoral piece, and I think all of those things came from, as Fran said, from books that he read as a child. But also the relationship with the books that he read as a child is between that and Alice is one of great rebellion. Alice is in some ways very much like children in, say, in the Fairchild Family or in Harry and Lucy or in some of these other books that Lewis Carroll wrote, in that she is curious and these sorts of things. But unlike those children, she is not at the mercy of adults. She speaks truth to power, and she eventually tells all grown-ups, you are all just a pack of cards. And that's a huge rebellion against the sort of didactic books that he read as a child.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is really interesting, because what I really like is that you can really see that development, because at first Alice falls down the rabbit hole and she cries and she's really upset, and then she meets all of those characters that trample all over her. At times literally, but it's quite interesting that eventually she asks questions that get more and more uncomfortable, and then eventually, so it's at the tea party, I think, when she's just like, no, I've had enough of this. It's the stupidest tea party in my life, and just walks out of that. And I think that's what makes the story so relatable as well.
And she gradually gains control. I think the two books together really are very much about the passage from childhood to adulthood. You see it in the framing poems, where at the end of Looking Glass, it's sort of this melancholy poem about the loss of childhood. But you also see it in, as she said, Alice starts out pretty helpless. She's just falling. She can't do anything. By the middle of the book, she's able to control her size and all sorts of other things. By the end of that book, she's able to tell adults that they're nothing but a pack of cards. And by the end of the second book, she's a queen. She's ascended to the very height of adulthood, and it's this sort of gradual journey along the way as she gains more and more self-confidence, self-control, and a sort of ability to control the world around her.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. Because, I think Lewis Carroll really had retained a vivid understanding of what it was to be a child as an adult. And, the world can be quite confusing when you're a child. And I think going back to what you were saying, Fran, about dreams being this place where you can pour everything out and sort of process things and work through things, it sort of works to me that it's a safe place, isn't it? Where, particularly in Victorian society, and you're growing up and there's all these rules, you have to do things a certain way. I guess to me it says that she enters this safe space where she can push back and she can sort of test boundaries and things. It's kind of, like you say, this development as she gets more control.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really interesting. That's why I really like that episode at the end with Alice's sister, because it's almost sort of a hint what the book is there for. Don't be afraid to come back to this book. Because, as you say, we're still massively fascinated with the book. The book is still read, and not just by children, also by adults who keep coming back to it. And that's kind of what is foreshadowed at the end of the book, because Alice's sister, the sort of enigmatic sister in the book, is older than her, and Alice runs off, and this is the first sort of recipient of the story of Alice's adventures in Wonderland, and she starts imagining Alice's dream as she's just told it, and she closes her eyes and she imagines the story taking place.
So she sat on, with closed eyes, and half believed herself in Wonderland. Though she knew she had but to open them again, and all would change to dull reality.
And she's already growing, I think the phrasing is she's growing weary of the world around her. So she really is returning to the sort of state of childhood, and the book is reminding her of what that was like and what that state of mind is like. And, even as an adult where you take certain ways of thinking and acting for granted, Lewis Carroll wants you to return to this. And it's really interesting because then she has this moment, will Alice also read this to her children? And, Alice in that moment stands for very many people who read that book.
Lastly, she pictured to herself how this same little sister of hers would, in the aftertime, be herself a grown woman, and how she would keep, through all her riper years, the simple and loving heart of her childhood, and how she would gather about her other little children, and make their eyes bright and eager with many a strange tale, perhaps even with the dream of Wonderland of long ago, and how she would feel with all their simple sorrows, and find a pleasure in all their simple joys, remembering her own child life, and the happy summer days.
And, you said that you think that Lewis Carroll had a deep understanding of what it means to be a child, but I think I would take that one step farther and say that Lewis Carroll was maybe not by himself, but was one of the people who invented the modern concept of what childhood is. I mean, before this, children were seen really almost as miniature adults. They were there in order for adults to cram knowledge and morality into them. And in many cases, they were there in order to do the same work that adults did. They worked in factories, they worked in fields, they worked on farms, they worked in coal mines, and the idea of a childhood as a sort of prolonged period of innocence and leisure and entertainment is a pretty new idea. And I think Lewis Carroll was in many ways instrumental in creating that. He was constantly trying to find ways to entertain children. And certainly we can get into questions of class. I mean, even Lewis Carroll probably would have, he could be a snob sometimes when it came to class. But I think the idea that people other than just the children of the very, very rich might still enjoy an innocent childhood full of entertainments, that was starting to emerge at the time. And he was a big part of promoting that, I think.
Hi, this is just a really quick reminder that if you're enjoying the stories on Willow Audiobooks, it would mean the absolute world to me if you'd consider becoming a patron on Patreon. There are 3 different pledge tiers, all with different perks attached to them. And above all, you'd be helping me to make sure I can keep doing this consistently. So please head on over to patreon.com/Willow Audiobooks and check out how you can get involved. Alternatively, I also really appreciate ratings and reviews left on iTunes or wherever you happen to get your podcasts. So if you haven't done that, please do. Thank you so much.
Oh, Kitty, how nice it would be if we could only get through into Looking Glass House. I'm sure it's got, such beautiful things in it. Let's pretend the glass has got all soft like gauze so that we can get through. Why, it's turning into a sort of mist now, I declare. It'll be easy enough to get through. It's a great huge game of chess that's being played all over the world.
You'll go very quickly through the third square. By railway, I should think. The fourth square belongs to Tweedledum and Tweedledee. No-how, contrary-wise. When you get to the eighth square, you'll be a queen.
One can't believe impossible things.
Why? Sometimes I've believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. Hello, welcome back to this Willow Branches episode all about Lewis Carroll. Just while we've paused, I just wanted to give a mention to the wonderful Judith, who runs the Instagram account called Carrollian Memes. She is a huge fan of Alice and Lewis Carroll, and a few months ago I asked her to share what exactly makes her such a fan of the books. Her full response is available to read on the Willow Audiobooks Instagram page, but I wanted to share a brief excerpt here. Judith says, I can't fully describe how wonderful these books were to me. I was clearly amazed by everything. The characters, the wordplay, the nonsense story, the more thoughtful moments too. I remember my copy began with the translator's introduction, so that was the first thing I read before the proper contents. In this introduction, the translator wrote of the incredible power of these timeless stories and how they reflect the human unconscious. I still remember one metaphor that stayed with me since then. The Alice books are ruled by the logic of dreams, because dreams have a logic of their own. Another, perhaps equally important idea, was how there are 2 books packed into one, a book for children and a book for the very mature. As I said, you can read Judith's full response on Instagram at Willow Audiobooks, so do check that out. For now, let's go back to my conversation with Francisca and Charlie. Why do you think the Alice books in particular are so seminal in the history of children's literature?
I think there's several things. One is, while the Alice books may not have been the very first books that sort of rejected this notion that all children's books should be didactic and moralistic, they were certainly the first that were, quite successful, that had that view. It was a new, but it's not just that view that's different. If you look at popular children's books of today, even so much of what you see comes from Alice, the child being at the center of the narrative, and sort of the child being much more in control rather than the adults being in control. I mean, that was a big turning point, that the child was in control of the narrative. And again, the child speaking truth to power. You'd look at even something like the Harry Potter books, children standing up to adults. This notion of sort of a deeper level of morality than what the adults are trying to teach you. Where Alice is able to say, look, you guys are being ridiculous here. And you see that happen again and again in subsequent children's literature. So I think that was a big turn. And then I also think that one of the reasons the Alice books have persisted is because of the sort of dream nature, the sort of almost surrealistic nature, has meant that each subsequent generation can sort of hang upon those books whatever they want to hang upon those books. I mean, in the 1960s, the drug generation embraced the books, even though they had nothing to do with drugs, but they could see that you can see almost anything in them that you want to see in them. And that has made them continue to be relevant generation after generation.
I think one of the things that's really central to why we are still so drawn to the book is because, well, 2 things. Because they give us relief and because we can relate. One of the things that I said earlier is that we observe Alice's journey, we're almost shadowing her on her journey, and we can see a story where you go from, as Charlie said, sort of falling down the rabbit hole and having absolutely no control, wondering what on earth is going on all around us, and being sort of confronted with absolutely ludicrous stuff and ludicrous systems that are being run there that way because they are. If you think of the caucus race and the dodo being completely unable to explain what's actually going on and why everybody's just running around frantically in circles. But you just have to take part in it, and somehow you then have to take a role in it. And that's, of course, what you're meant to be doing. But it's all really confusing and it doesn't make any sense. And it's something that we can all relate to. We've been in situations like that before. But it's also that we don't very often get any room in our rational adult life to take a break from that. And so, of course, that's something we do every night when we're dreaming, but that's something that the book does in a more structured and a more guided way and gives us a more satisfying outcome too, because we observe this journey, we go through this journey with Alice, and we go through that ultimate rejection of that ridiculous tea party. And I'm sure every one of us has sat in a meeting that was just a little bit like the Mad Tea Party. And you kind of just wanted to go like, this is the most ridiculous meeting I have ever seen, and just walk out of it and slam the door. And then you get into the sort of boss's office who's just called you in, and he is shouting across the room, and you just want to go like, oh, you're nothing but a pack of cards. And it's got this satisfying, cathartic outcome that Alice literally just punches the cards out of the way and wakes up. And that was it. And it's safe. And it's also just bloody funny, isn't it?
Yeah.
This Mad Tea Party, there's this scene with Mad Hatter and who's obviously not the the Mad Hatter in the story, but the Hatter, which is important. I can talk more about that. But it's really interesting because there's this moment where he goes like, he dips the watch in the tea and he makes a joke about rubbing the butter in the tea, and he so meekly says, but it was the best butter, which is of course completely pointless, and it always cracks me up. It doesn't matter, you just rub butter into a watch, for heaven's sake.
I told you butter wouldn't suit the works, he added, looking angrily at the March Hare. It was the best butter, the March Hare meekly replied. Yes, but some crumbs must have got in as well, the Hatter grumbled. You shouldn't have put it in with the bread knife. The March Hare took the watch and looked at it gloomily. Then he dipped it into his cup of tea and looked at it again, but he could think of nothing better to say than his first remark. It was the best butter, you know.
It's really good. No, it's just really funny, isn't it?
I think what it kind of all adds up to, what we've both been saying, and that made this book so revolutionary and makes it still so relevant, is that it is, unlike almost any book that came before it, it honestly portrays the adult world from the point of view of the child. And from the point of view of the child, the adult world is very often madness. It's very easy to remember when you were a kid and you looked at the way adults acted and you thought, what are they thinking? This is ridiculous. And that had never really been portrayed before. And I would still maintain that is often and still at the center of a lot of children's books.
Yeah.
The very honest view of the adult world from the point of view of the child. It's something that a lot of times adults don't want to think about because
Definitely.
it doesn't reflect well on them, but it makes for great children's literature.
It's quite funny for adults too, because here we are, three adults talking about this story, and it was written by an adult for children, but let's face it, most of the children would have been read the story by their parents or by another adult. So there's a dimension of the story for adults too, and that I actually find so interesting because especially about the Mad Tea Party. Mad tea parties were a thing. There were really tea parties at Victorian lunatic asylums, and they were quite widely reflected upon in Victorian newspapers and so on, because there was a real interest in this sort of thing, and that Carroll was parodying this, and that the adults were in the position of the lunatics. That's such a role reversal here. Carroll is making clear as an adult author that this is a particular attitude to adulthood that's ludicrous, and that we can actually all sort of become better adults by sort of returning to childhood and sort of starting over again in how we actually should be doing things. And so I think that's what makes the story so great for children and adults alike.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember to go back to that day on the boat in 1862.
Exactly.
There was another adult in that boat too. There were 4 people listening to that story, and 3 of them were children, and one of them was an adult, one of Lewis Carroll's colleagues at another college. And there certainly must have been moments during that narrative when he turned to Robinson Duckworth and sort of winked at him and said, this joke is for us, and so I don't think there's any doubt that from the very genesis, it was a book that was going to appeal to both children and adults.
Oh yeah.
And just returning to the theme of madness, that's obviously another big theme in the book. And I'm curious just on your thoughts on maybe the Victorian idea of madness versus, in contrast with our current understanding of mental health and stuff like that.
Oh, I think that's another topic I could talk about for hours. But so that's really interesting, because if we look at a different word for the word madness, insanity, insane is the unhealthy mind. And Lewis Carroll was very, very concerned with what constitutes a healthy mind, because when we look at the term psychology, the hint is in the word. Psychology is the science of the soul. And it's not just the health of the mind, but the health of the soul. And that's something that Lewis Carroll, with his devout Christianity, was very, very concerned with. And when he said, I want something that is healthful for the soul, then that puts his writing into a completely different mindset. And when we then sort of come back to the idea of a dream, of a sort of pouring out of everything that's going on in the soul and sort of sorting through it and healing the soul, which sort of comes back to the point I was making, why the story is still so attractive, that we go through that catharsis with Alice. I think it puts the story into a completely different light, because of course laughter can be cathartic. Laughing at the people who are right at the top of behaving, questionably, that's cathartic. And so when Carroll was writing this, he had in the back of his mind conceptions of dreams whereby some Victorian psychologists considered madness in themselves. So that puts into an interesting light that when Alice is sort of facing forking paths in her dream and asks the Cheshire Cat, well, which way should I go? I don't want to go among mad people.
In that direction, the cat said, waving its right paw around, lives a hatter. And in that direction, waving the other paw, lives a March hare. Visit either you like. They're both mad. But I don't want to go among mad people, Alice remarked. Oh, you can't help that, said the cat. We're all mad here. I'm mad. You're mad.
And the Cheshire Cat quite rightly says to her, well, doesn't matter, we're all mad here, because you're all in that dream, right? And so that's an interesting one, though, because Carroll was so concerned about what constitutes dreaming and what it means and what madness means. And it meant so much to him to sort of work out through dreams the mechanisms of our mind so that we can work with them to make our mind, to make our soul healthy.
And I think this notion plays out later in his life and in his works, because in his work in logic, because what is madness? Madness is when you act illogically, right? And he was fascinated by, one might even say obsessed with, logic in his later years. Is what he did most of his work on. But a lot of his work on logic was focused at educating young people to think logically, whether it was the game of logic or symbolic logic, or he would go into schools and he had these little logic sheets printed up that he could help teach the children logic. And so I think in a way that was a way to stave off madness, to be sure that you were thinking and acting in a logical way. And he connected that to so many things. He said, if you can make a logical argument, then you can spot the illogical argument, whether it comes from the politician or the priest in the pulpit, or your greengrocer. It doesn't matter. You can spot the person who's acting not in a logical way. But I think there's a definite connection between madness and acting illogically, and then his work on logic and trying to educate especially young people to understand logic and to think logically.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's really, really important, because when we talk about mathematics, I think we all have a slightly different notion of mathematics than the one Lewis Carroll or people at Lewis Carroll's time had, and maybe more specifically Lewis Carroll's environment, especially at Oxford, because mathematics was something at the time and at Oxford very specifically tied to God and the church, and that might sound really weird to us now. But when mathematics was taught at the University of Oxford, there were various professorial chairs, and they were dedicated specifically to the study of geometry and the study of astronomy. And so that's perhaps not the most intuitive fields of mathematics for us right now, but they are the fields that measured, in a way, the creation of God, the heavens and the earth. Everything that's manifest here on earth and everything that's in the heavens. And that's, of course, the assertion of the truth of God's creation, or inherent in God's creation. And that's really interesting when we look at Lewis Carroll's interest in logic, because he had the same approach to language, and measuring language, or sort of analyzing or dissecting language in a way into components that indicate what is true and what is false, to sort of say, there is the truth, this is how we can spot it, because that's what you do in a mathematical formula. You sort of rearrange it and then go, yeah, this is how it indicates the truth.
Yeah, fascinating. And I on the logic front as well, like it seems to me that what you were saying about language as well, that a lot of the characters in the book, they present what looks on paper like quite logical arguments, but that we know inherently don't actually make sense. And Alice obviously challenges them, but that it seems like a lot of the characters follow this very sort of pedantic, logical use of language. But it's funny how it falls apart if you interrogate it.
Yeah, I've always thought it's funny how whenever Alice calls one of the adult characters on a logical fallacy, their response is to change the subject.
Yeah.
So the two that come to mind immediately are moving around the table at the Mad Tea Party.
It's always tea time, and we've no time to wash the things between whiles.
Then you keep moving round, I suppose, said Alice.
Exactly so, said the Hatter, as the things get used up.
But what happens when you come to the beginning again? Alice ventured to ask.
Suppose we change the subject, the March Hare interrupted, yawning.
Yeah.
And then when she's talking to the Mock Turtle and the Griffin about lessons.
And how many hours a day did you do lessons? Said Alice, in a hurry to change the subject.
10 hours the first day, said the Mock Turtle. 9 the next, and so on.
What a curious plan, exclaimed Alice.
That's the reason they're called lessons, the Griffin remarked. Because they lesson from day to day.
This was quite a new idea to Alice, and she thought it over a little before she made her next remark. Then the 11th day must have been a holiday.
Of course it was, said the Mock Turtle.
And how did you manage on the 12th? Alice went on eagerly.
That's enough about lessons,
the Griffin interrupted in a very decided tone.
And so Alice is already starting to think like a logician. And the people around her are not. They're in denial of that logic exists, which again takes us back to the idea of madness.
Why don't you tell me, do you have a favourite scene or character from the two Alice books? And if so, why?
So I've been asked this before when Andy Malcolm was making his film about Alice in New York in 2015.
Oh, Andy was the last person to ask me that question.
Yeah, and so I'm trying to, but I think what I said to Andy, and it just sort of popped into my mind at the time, but I think I'm going to stake with it, is that scene that we've been talking about, that last scene on the riverbank after Alice goes away, and it's just her sister, thinking about the connections between reality and the dream, and then thinking about the future and Alice growing up and telling her children stories. And maybe it's because, I'm an adult with grown children and hope to have grandchildren someday. I don't know why it is that speaks to me, but there's a both a sort of a joy and a melancholy, and again, a pastoral nature to that scene that to me just kind of pulls it all together. And it always makes me really sad when I see editions of that book where they go, oh, well, that's not really part of the Alice's story. So let's cut out those 5 paragraphs, because I just think it's beautifully written.
Oh yeah, I quite agree, and I think it came through quite clearly earlier that I really do like that as well. And I think it's so important to just in general to understand the meaning of the book, to sort of dwell on that passage a little bit. I think what I said last time was that I really quite like the Cheshire Cat, and I really do like the Cheshire Cat. It's really interesting because I was talking about these classic dream stories, and you think of Dante's Divine Comedy, and you think of the Pilgrim's Progress, and every one of those heroes going on a journey gets a really useful guide. You have the evangelist, you have Virgil, and they're all sort of super helpful. They're sort of they leave occasionally and they come back, and but they always come with some sort of insight, and they actually deserve the name guide in some function. But the Cheshire Cat is hilarious because it just turns up and then states the obvious and says, "Well, we're all mad here. Just well." Have to get on yourself. But it's so interesting because I really like that, because I think sometimes we just need a Cheshire Cat popping up in our lives that states the obvious to everyone.
The Cheshire Cat also comes back later on in what must be one of the great, I don't know if you want to call it logical arguments or existential arguments that in literature, where the discussion is being had about whether you can cut the head off a cat who only has a head.
The executioner's argument was that you couldn't cut off a head unless there was a body to cut it off from, that he had never had to do such a thing before and he wasn't going to begin at his time of life. The king's argument was that anything that had a head could be beheaded, and that you weren't to talk nonsense. The queen's argument was that if something wasn't done about it in less than no time, she'd have everybody executed all round.
It's right up there with what is the sound of one hand clapping. It's a very existential kind of Buddhist question that just gets thrown out there, and of course, obviously never answered. But I just love the way he can just throw these incredibly deep questions out in the middle of a children's book and just keep going,
and get away with impunity, and then you just vanish, and then you just come back and nothing ever happens. It's just the most brilliant thing. Imagine having like this cat popping up in every conversation and just commenting on it. I think that would just be brilliant. I think you should just have that. I think the Cheshire Cat just amuses me endlessly, and it's of course so brilliant because when we we started off with the book, and I think going back to the book always makes it quite nice, because the illustration of the Cheshire Cat is vividly animated in the book. And the original book, when it sits up there in its branch, when you turn the page and it disappears, the pictures were placed in such a way that it actually disappears when you fold over the page back and forth again and again really quickly. It's like one of those illusions of those flip books where something just disappears as you run through the pages, and that was intentional. And it's just so great because I think even the animation of the book itself, so much thought went into the production of the book, so much fantasy, so much dedication to what he wanted to achieve with the book. And I think the Cheshire Cat is manifest evidence of that in the book, and that's just one of the very many dimensions of it that makes me like it so much.
I think that's an important point to understand how closely involved Lewis Carroll was with the design and production of his own books. I mean, the Alice books were printed at his expense, when the first edition had a few printing issues, he at his expense scrapped it and started all over again. But he worked, he could be very frustrating to work with from the point of view of his illustrators, because he didn't just say, here's the book, illustrate it. He wanted to talk about what the illustrations were, how they were placed on the page, how they interacted with the text. And if you read his letters to Macmillan, he can get very persnickety, but the results are, when you look at his books, they are beautifully designed books. And there's a unity to his books for children in the way that they're bound, the kind of cloth they use, the binding decorations and everything, so that when you see them sitting together on a shelf, you're like, wow, somebody really took care to produce a lovely, lovely set of books.
Yeah, because of course he did his own illustrations first, didn't he? For the manuscript he gave to Alice. Yeah. And did he then pass those on to John Tenniel as a model?
I'm not sure about that, Fran. Do you know? I don't know if Tenniel ever saw those illustrations or not.
I don't actually know. I don't. I don't know. Is the honest answer.
Yeah.
It's interesting because Tenniel also we don't have the full set of correspondences between them, but it's really
Yeah.
interesting because Tenniel did speak back to Carroll on what he thought worth illustrating and what not, and it's really interesting that Carroll sort of was still writing while he was illustrating. There's this letter saying, "Oh, he sent me like another version of the Mad Tea Party, and I still don't know. Is there more to come or something?" So he gets quite frustrated with it. So, and we know,
And
for instance, that the Mad Tea Party was still sort of left till quite late.
yeah, and famously, Tenniel was responsible for the exclusion of one of the episodes in Through the Looking Glass. He said that
Ah,
that
yes.
illustrating a wasp in a wig was beyond his abilities as an artist. Um, but it's fascinating to see not only Dodgson editing Tenniel, but in that case, Tenniel editing Dodgson.
Yeah.
Um,
I was going to ask about that, actually. I've heard about the wasp in the wig that as a missing episode, missing chapter. Does the text of that survive? Can we read it anywhere?
It does. It survives in a galley proof that's been published, pretty widely published. It was published originally by the Lewis Carroll Society of North America in 1977, and then widely published in the papers and elsewhere after that. And then there's even editions of the book in which it appears. And I think the
Oh.
general consensus is maybe that it's not quite up to the level of
I was
some
going
of
to
the
say,
other
do you
writing.
think the book's better without it?
I think it's
Yeah.
fascinating to read, but I think it's very hard to go back and say, after you know a book so well,
Yes.
to say, well, would it be better if you shoved this somewhat unfamiliar episode into a place that you now think of as having a sort of nice, smooth transition? Your answer is almost always going to be no. That would be jarring to me because so it's hard to come to it with completely fresh eyes, I think.
So yeah, if somebody listening is interested to maybe find out a bit more about Lewis Carroll and his work and life, what would be their first port of call, do you think?
Well, I would say join your National Lewis Carroll Society. If you're in the United States, that's the Lewis Carroll Society of North America, or in Britain, the Lewis Carroll Society, or join both because they both have great publications and they both have great online events, and eventually, once again, we'll have in-person events. But and it just gives you an opportunity to meet a lot of people with a lot of knowledge. And then there's so many good books out there. I mean, I think if you were to only read one book, I would recommend the Letters of Lewis Carroll. It's a 2-volume book, but I think even more than the Diaries, you really get to know Lewis Carroll well through those letters. But I think it's hugely important to I mean, yes, read a good biography. There's lots of them, but go back to the primary material because there's so much of it, and it's so rich, and it gives you a real feeling for his personality and sort of everything about him that you won't get from reading it, the best of the biographies.
Yeah, I agree with Charlie. I think sort of going back to the to Lewis Carroll's own writings, and just to blow Charlie's trumpet for him, Charlie's written a fantastic book, Lewis Carroll Among His Books, where he records Lewis Carroll's library and what we know of it. That's really, really fascinating as well, and that's, I think, one of the best places to start. Read Lewis Carroll's own writing and what he was preoccupied with.
So thank you so much for coming on to talk to me. It's been such a delight to hear from you, hear your knowledge and your expertise and your insights. So thank you. And where can we find you online and your work and stuff if we want to?
Okay, my own work can be found on my website, which is just my name with a .com behind it. I'm also on Twitter, where you can find me as Frankendodo, because I would really quite like to reanimate dodos. I think they're awfully awesome, and I would quite like to have one. But yes, I've written several articles on Lewis Carroll. I've appeared in some documentaries. There have been some really great documentaries made by my old university, the University of Oxford, where, of course, famously Lewis Carroll also wrote his book. And I am also writing 2 books at the moment, one of which is of a very academic nature about my research on Victorian dreams in science. and in fantastic literature. And I'm also writing a book for sort of wider audiences that's hopefully going to be more widely available, which is looking especially at my fascination with Lewis Carroll's fascination with science, how that shaped Alice in Wonderland, and how we can still find that influence in the books and the works and the art and the popular culture references that adapt Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. But you'll have to wait till next year till that all comes out. In the meantime, I'm also the organizer of the Through the Looking Glass sesquicentenary conference, which is taking place later this year. So if you feel you have something to say on this topic of Through the Looking Glass, please give me a shout, submit a paper to the conference, and it would be great to hear more from you. And yes, I think that's about it. And I hope you enjoyed our ramblings. And that's that from me.
You can find me on my website, which is just charlielovett.com. You will see mostly my novels there, and it's also a link to my podcast where I interview other novelists. But my Lewis Carroll work is widely available. I've written a number of books, including, as Fran said, Lewis Carroll Among His Books, which is a sort of list and analysis of Lewis Carroll's library. And then my most recent was the sixth volume in the complete pamphlets of Lewis Carroll, the series that was just completed by the Lewis Carroll Society of North America and University of Virginia Press. And that's about 500 pages of new Lewis Carroll material and my commentary thereon. So some of the things you've heard us talking about, like the writings about vivisection, are printed in there, along with an essay about the context in which they exist. So those are all the pamphlets that were not in previous volumes. The previous volumes were Oxford pamphlets, mathematical, logic, political, and games. And so I got sort of everything else. And then I do have a book called Lewis Carroll, Formed by Faith, The Religious Life of Charles Lutwidge Dodgson. That will be coming out from the University Press of Virginia next year, I think in the spring. And Fran mentioned her Through the Looking Glass conference that's in November. I'll be one of the keynote speakers at that conference, talking about the idea of reflection in Lewis Carroll's Christian life.
That's amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This has been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much.
To stay updated with Willow Audiobooks, you can follow us on social media. Just search for Willow Audiobooks on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Or you can visit our webpage at stephenalexanderwillis.com/Willow Audiobooks. Why not leave a rating or a review on iTunes or wherever you happen to get your podcasts?